My name's Fiona and I'm the Creative Director of the Ballarat International Foto Biennale, and for the last 25 years I was the Creative Director of Sweet Creative, a branding and design agency in St Kilda Road in St Kilda. The industry today is far more exciting and innovative than it was in 1988 when I started my career. In those days there was no technology, no computers, and as such a lot of the work was focused around the action of creating the product. And I think today with the development and the advent of significant computers, what we're able to do as designers is to have a lot more time to do the creative thinking and develop far more interesting relationships with our clients and about the role of design. So as I said, I graduated in 1988. I found it very difficult to get my first job. There were not as many design students as there are today, but even so there weren't as many agencies as well. So my first job was with one of my previous lecturers. He asked me to work with him in his studio in St Kilda, and I worked there for quite a few years doing a lot of packaging and not really that interested in purely doing one design component or another. I moved from that point on to a lot of different design agencies and advertising agencies until I found that I was really most happy working within the arts. So I worked in the design department of the Victorian Arts Centre for about probably 10 years, and then I left there to have my first child, and at that point I didn't really know what I was going to do. I didn't know if I was going to continue doing design or become a full-time mother, but a lot of the clients approached me through that circle and asked me to do work, and I started working from home. And the client base was very much an evolution as opposed to a conscious decision of who the clients were that I would like. So a lot of them were friends within the arts arena, and from those friendships grew relationships with other clients, and then slowly the company established itself to have staff and an organisational structure. It was one of the lecturers approached me and asked me to work for him, but it wasn't a structure like we have today where you have significant exhibitions and industry people are invited to see your work, and there was no real structure in terms of progressing your career into the next stage of employment. So the course was very much about the course, and then off you went and explored where you thought you could go. Learning about the history of any design or photography or the history of any art form is really, really important. It gives you a sense of place, and it gives you a sense of history, of where you come from and where you can, of course, then eventually progress to. When I was studying graphic design in the late 80s, there were no courses that included the history of graphic design. We learnt about the history of art, but we didn't learn about the history of graphic design. So once I became a graphic designer in my trade, I became very interested in looking at where design comes from and what the relevance is in relationship to culture, architecture, other design principles, and even, I suppose, economics. So the more that we understand our relationships to the visual language and where they come from, whether it be colour, composition or type, the more we can actually use those references in a valid and relevant way in our own practice. The most exciting designer that I saw in my youth was Neville Brody. He was the first person of my generation to take the computer and push and shape typography, and as we know, he was well known for the work he did in the face. But for us, we'd always been constrained by type. Type was a situation where we would mark up our type. We would ask a type house to produce it for us, and then it would be stuck together by the finished artist, and then our concept would then be finished. So I think the two most interesting people for me in the history of design would be Neville Brody and Paul Lasher. Both of them played with typography, particularly in the early ages of the 80s when technology had just moved into our sphere. At the time, I didn't think that the fact that she was a woman designer had any relevance, but I think when I look back on now, I think I was quite excited that someone who was a woman was doing such creative work that was so internationally recognised. And because a lot of her work in those early days, particularly with public theatre, was to do with the theatre world, I think that was probably that's also why she was such a strong influence with me. And her design was not necessarily feminine, which also excited me. It was clever and strong and contemporary as opposed to soft and flowery. I think that by continuing for over 20 years to run a design studio, that's, I think, been quite significant as a woman, particularly keeping the studio quite small and focused on the arts. And I think that some of my involvements with AGDA, I was on the board for a short period of time, my involvement with students and interns through the Swinburne program, and lecturing and communicating with other students through various channels has probably given me a little bit of a face in the Australian landscape. I tend to not sell myself very much in the industry. I prefer for the work to sell itself. I've never really intentionally gone out and promoted myself as a significant player or a significant female designer, but I'm quite thrilled to be nominated. I didn't really believe that I would be that well known, to be honest. A lot of designers are very quiet in their disposition, and I think I'm someone that's very much like that too. I like the work to speak for itself, and often when I'm put in a position where I'm asked to give critical discussion or advice about design, I find that I'd rather let someone else who's got stronger speaking skills to talk in that way. And yet when you do work in an agency and your work does win awards and you do have a significant client base, people do know who you are. So the advantages of having a reputation is that from a business perspective, it helps your organisation to grow and stay successful. But the disadvantages are that you can always be criticised, I suppose, for things that you say that are not agreed to. I think that's less significant. Yes, I do. I think that there's a strong difference between the way I run a studio and the way my colleagues who are men run studios. I think that you can consider personality type as well. I don't think you can be completely exclusive and divide it by gender. However, the collaborative nature of my studio was often discussed by staff as a very different way of working to other studios they'd worked in, and the kind of the care and attention to the work, and ensuring that the staff were given the recognition for the work that they did, as well as perhaps even to the little things like starting work at 9 and finishing work at 5 was an ethos that I felt to be very significant in my studio. It's a little thing, but it actually changes the emphasis of the work practice for designers. Well, client relationships was exclusively my job. It's one of the hardest jobs in a studio, and because the studio was run by me from the creative direction perspective as well as client liaison, it put a lot of stress on my job. Part of the reason why I chose to move on after 20 years. But it also meant that because I owned the business and I was the person that was the client liaison, I could make really firm decisions about who I wanted to work with and who I didn't. And I think that that's another thing that I think in terms of gender, that often women are mothers and they often have to go home to their children at the end of the day. So those sorts of decisions were significant in terms of who I would choose as my clients. I needed clients that understood that this was a job and that we would do the best that we possibly could, but we weren't going to work all day and all night to fulfil their obligations, our obligations. So just 6 months into my job as Festival and Creative Director of a very interesting photographic biennale, in fact the only photographic biennale in Australia, and it's based in a very small historical town called Ballarat, which is about an hour and a half west of Melbourne. So the job uses many of my skills that I've used as a designer and as a business owner, administration, liaising, volunteers, staff and creative concepts. But what it does very differently to working in an agency is that I'm really directly working with the artists, and the aim and objective is to ensure that the photographers have the best possible exhibitions and the best possible exposure. So you actually take financial considerations out of the question, and for me that's just wonderful.